What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another episode of Darkly Speaking. I'm Alex Kern, and tonight we're going to peel back the layers of a story that's haunted me for a really long time. One that's strange, unsettling, and filled with questions that still have no answers. The kind of case that sends you spiraling down a rabbit hole at 3 a.m. convinced you missed something that detectives didn't. And at the center of it all is a man named Robert Wone, an attorney, a friend, a newlywed, who walked into a house in D.C. for what should have been just a simple overnight stay. But he never walked out. So let's start where the investigators started. August 2nd, 2006. The time was 11:49 p.m. The address, 1509 Swann Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. Inside that three-story home lived four people, a couple, Joseph and Victor, who shared the top floor, their friend Dylan, whose room was on the second floor, and their fourth roommate, Sarah, who had the basement to herself. But Sarah was out of town that night, and someone else took her place. That someone was Robert Wone. Robert had known Joseph since their college days. He lived in Virginia, but worked late hours in D.C., and that night, it just made more sense to crash at a friend's place rather than make the commute all the way back home, which is, totally normal. Nothing sketchy. He let his wife know the plan, and she didn't think twice about it. None of them could have known that this favor, this simple, mundane decision, was about to mark the end of Robert's life. Everything seemed quiet on Swann Street until it wasn't. Victor races out of the house in a white bathrobe, completely frantic, calling 911.
DC Emergency 911 operator 6752. Do you need police, fire, or ambulance?
Immediately. We need an ambulance.
What's wrong, ma'am?
We had someone in our house, evidently, and they stabbed somebody.
Okay, somebody's inside the house now?
I don't know. We heard.
Are they bleeding? You see someone bleeding?
Someone is bleeding in our house.
Okay, where's they bleeding from?
I think in the stomach.
The stomach? Is he cautious? Calm down for me. I'm going to send some help, okay? Female or male?
It's a male. He's a friend of ours. He was spending the night with us.
Okay, and who was the person that stabbed him? Do you know? Is he conscious?
We need an ambulance.
Ma'am, listen to me.
He's not conscious.
He's not conscious at all?
No. We need someone right now.
Is he breathing? Listen to me. Calm down. I'm going to help you, okay? Is he breathing?
I'm upstairs, and he's downstairs. I don't know.
Okay, who's downstairs with him?
My partner is downstairs with him right now. He told me to go upstairs and call the police immediately. I just went to the stairs.
Okay, who's the person? Okay, I'm sending paramedics and the police. Okay, who's the person that stabbed him?
I don't know. We think it's somebody with an intruder in the house. We heard the chime at the door.
And it's 15, ma'am, calm down. 1509 Swann Street Northwest, am I correct?
Yes, it is.
The person that stabbed him, is he still in the home?
I don't know.
Okay, we got help en route, okay?
Pardon me?
We have help en route.
Thank you. They're here.
They are en route to you now. I'm sending the police and the paramedics, okay, to assist. Okay, what I need you to do is go downstairs, okay? The place wherever he was stabbed at, I need you to get a dry cloth, okay? And just apply pressure to that area. Wherever he was stabbed at on his body, I need you to take a towel downstairs while you're waiting for the paramedics to arrive and just apply pressure. Even if the rag or towel is saturated with blood, just get another towel and put it on top, but never lift the first towel off the area. Hold it on. Once it gets filled up with blood, just put another towel on top of that and just apply pressure until the paramedics arrive. Yes.
On the leg.
Yeah.
We're stabbed in the heart.
In the heart?
Yes. In the center of his chest.
Okay. Is he breathing?
Is he breathing?
We have help en route now, okay? You don't know who it was?
No idea. Don't touch this.
Okay, is he breathing?
He's breathing, but he needs help now.
Okay, we have help en route, ma'am, okay? We do have help en route. Okay, just go down there and try to tell your husband or your the other half to just try to keep him calm and talk to him, okay? Keep him calm and talk to him until someone gets there. Okay. And at the same time, get a dry cloth and just hold it right there in the area.
My partner's holding the...
Okay.
Holding it on him.
Okay, and once it gets saturated with blood, tell him get another one. Go get another towel so you can apply it on top of that one once it gets filled up with blood. We need you to apply pressure on that area.
He is applying pressure, right?
Okay, just hold it there until the paramedics get there. They should be pulling up any moment if they're already en route to your location. You don't know who did this.
We have no idea who did this.
Victor told the dispatcher that someone had broken into his home and had committed a horrific crime. Specifically, Victor said, quote, "We think it was somebody, an intruder in the house. We heard a chime, the door. We had someone in our house, evidently, and they stabbed somebody." But when the operator offered to send police, ambulance, and firefighters, Victor said, "No, we only need an ambulance," as if he was confident enough to think that the intruder was no longer in the home. This struck the operator as odd. The whole conversation was simply off. The call lasted for about 5 minutes and 40 seconds. Now, quick clarification here. Yes, Victor is a man. The 911 operator misgenders him during the call and he just never corrects her. But what matters most is what he says. He claims that someone broke in, that he heard a scream and the house alarm chime, then found Robert completely unresponsive in the second floor guest room. What happened inside the house that night has never been fully explained. And once you start pulling on the threads, things unravel fast. The part of the 911 call that stands out to me the most is when the dispatcher gives Victor some basic instructions. Grab a towel or a rag, apply pressure to Robert's stab wounds, and if the towel soaks through, stack another one and keep going until help arrives. Straightforward first aid, nothing unusual. And according to Victor, Joseph was already doing that while he stayed on the line. The call came in at 11:49 p.m. 5 minutes later, at 11:54 p.m., paramedics pulled up to Swann Street. These weren't rookies, by the way. They had over 25 years of field experience between them. They'd seen it all, but this night, this was different. Victor meets them at the door and tells them to head upstairs. As they make their way up, they spot Dylan in the hallway. He's also in a robe, and one of the EMTs asks what's going on. Dylan says nothing, just turns and walks away. Then they reach the guest room. There's Joseph sitting on the edge of the pull-out bed wearing only underwear, his back is to the door, and here's the thing. He's not doing anything. He's not applying pressure, he's not even touching Robert. The paramedics are immediately unsettled. In fact, seasoned EMT and paramedic Jeff Baker later said that the energy in the house made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. No one was panicked, no shouting, no urgency, just an eerie calm that didn't sit right. So much so that the EMT took the long route around the bed because he didn't want to turn his back to Joseph. He wanted to keep his eyes on him just in case. And then there was Robert. They finally reached him, and right away, alarm bells. Robert's gray t-shirt is soaked in 3 spots. 2 stab wounds in his abdomen, 1 in his heart, and the chest wound was large enough to fit a finger into. But there was almost no blood. None on the shirt, barely any in the room. Even the wounds weren't actively bleeding. One of the paramedics noticed faint streaks of blood on Robert's chest, but they looked wiped on, not flowing from the wound itself, like someone had smeared blood there intentionally. Then there was the bed. It wasn't slept in, it was perfectly made, sheets pulled back at a clean 45-degree angle. Robert lay on top, arms at his sides, head flat on the pillow, no wrinkles, no movement, no struggle. He was transported to the hospital, but he never had a chance. At 12:25 a.m., Robert Wone was pronounced dead, just 36 minutes after the 911 call. And the question now was, what happened in that house before anyone picked up the phone? To start untangling what happened that night, investigators focused on 2 priorities: question everyone in the house and treat the home like the crime scene it now was. While technicians began processing physical evidence, detectives sat down with Joseph, Victor, and Dylan, all of whom agreed to talk the same night. And for the most part, their stories matched. Dylan Ward lived on the 2nd floor in the room right next to the guest room where Robert slept. He told police that Robert arrived around 10:30 p.m. and that the 2 of them, along with Joseph, had a glass of water in the kitchen and chatted for a bit. Nothing major, just some casual conversation. Then they all went to bed. Dylan said he stayed up reading in bed for a while, and then he heard Robert take a shower before settling into the guest room. At some point after that, Dylan fell asleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to some kind of commotion. He stepped into the hallway and saw Victor on the phone with 911. Inside the guest room, Joseph was sitting on the bed in his underwear, pressing a towel to Robert's wounds. And not long after that, EMTs arrived. Victor Zaborski, Joseph's longtime partner, told detectives that he had returned home early from a business trip that day. He had been told in advance that Robert would be staying over, but Victor said that he was exhausted and decided to go to bed early. According to him, he never actually spoke to Robert that night. He said he was upstairs watching an episode of Project Runway when he heard the front door open. He looked at the clock around 10:30 p.m. and assumed it was Robert arriving. He didn't go down to greet him, but said he could hear Robert, Dylan, and Joseph chatting in the kitchen before everyone eventually went upstairs. Victor said that he and Joseph went to bed not too long after. Sometime later, he said that he was woken up by a chime from the home's alarm system, the kind that sounds whenever a door opens. The alarm itself wasn't set that night, but the door sensor still triggered the chime. He said they didn't think too much of it at first. Sarah, their fourth roommate, was supposed to be out of town, but for a moment they wondered if maybe she'd returned without telling them. Neither of them got up to check, but moments later, Victor claimed that they heard what he described as a soft, low scream or breathy grunting. That's when he and Joseph jumped out of bed and went straight to the guest room. There, according to Victor, they found Robert lying on the bed bleeding. Joseph told him to call 911, and that's when Victor made the call. Joseph Price's statement lined up with most of what Dylan and Victor had already told police. According to him, Robert got to the house at around 10:30 p.m. He said the three of them, Joseph, Dylan, and Robert, chatted briefly in the kitchen, had a glass of water, and then headed off to their respective rooms for the night. Joseph and Dylan went upstairs, and everyone settled in. Like Victor, Joseph said that they were woken up by the door chime from the alarm system. Moments later, he claimed they heard what he described as a faint scream. That's when he said both he and Victor got out of bed and went straight to the guest room where they found Robert lying on the bed. Joseph told investigators that Robert was on his back, not moving. He said he lifted Robert's shirt and saw blood, 3 stab wounds. Then, according to him, there was a knife resting on Robert's stomach. So he told police that he picked it up and moved it to the nightstand, and he made sure to get ahead of that detail. He told them something along the lines of, "I handled the knife, so you'll probably find my DNA on it, but you shouldn't find anyone else's because if someone else did this, they probably wore gloves." That statement definitely raised flags. It was oddly specific. No one had asked about the knife yet, but Joseph was already explaining away potential evidence. Some people might call that cooperative, others call it calculated. Joseph also said that he was the one applying pressure to Robert's wounds with the towel, while Victor stayed on the phone with 911. But what makes things even more complicated is that his story didn't stay consistent. Later, after speaking with police, Joseph changed a key part of his account. He now claimed that he hadn't just moved the knife off of Robert, he said he actually pulled it out of Robert's chest, then placed it on the nightstand. He also mentioned, again, that his fingerprints and DNA would likely be on it because he handled it while trying to help. That shift in his story about what he did with the knife and when only added to the growing suspicion, especially in a case where every detail was already under a microscope. During his interview with detectives, Joseph Price seemed particularly fixated on one thing: Dylan. Where was Dylan? What had he said? Could he see him? More than once, Joseph asked officers if Dylan had already finished his interview. At one point, he even called his brother to ask if Dylan had been released. He kept repeating the same concern. Did Dylan know that he had a right to a lawyer? To investigators, it stood out. The questions weren't about Robert, they were about Dylan. There were whispers that when police first arrived on scene, Dylan had been a little too chatty and that Joseph may have been giving him sharp looks as if trying to keep him in check. Whether or not that's true, we don't know for sure. But the police did uncover something during the interviews that added a new layer to Joseph's protectiveness. It turned out that the three men weren't just friends, they weren't just roommates, they were in a polyamorous relationship. Joseph and Victor were the primary couple, the most established, but Joseph also had a separate, intimate relationship with Dylan, one described as dominant, submissive in nature. The three of them were trying to make it all work as a family. This revelation changed the context. It didn't immediately point to a motive, and for a while, investigators weren't sure it mattered, but it added complexity, emotional dynamics, power imbalances, hidden tensions that couldn't be ignored. From that point forward, the investigation started to shift. because suddenly it wasn't just about who was in the house. It was about the roles they played in each other's lives and who might have had something to lose. Once the police had statements from all three men, they started comparing the stories to physical evidence inside the townhouse. The question was simple. Did what the men said actually line up with what was found at the scene? Two of them, Victor and Joseph, were pushing the idea that someone had broken in, that an unknown intruder came in and killed their house guest. So detectives went looking for signs of that. Forced entry, stolen items, anything that might point to that claim. But the answer they kept landing on was this: nothing was taken. First, the front door was locked. The men said that the back door might have been left open, which they pointed to as a possible entry point, especially since they claimed to hear the home's door chime. But that back door led to a small courtyard, gated and closed, surrounded by a 7-foot fence that was closed and locked when officers arrived. So if someone got in that way, they would have had to scale the fence, slip through a small courtyard, enter through the rear door, creep silently past 2 other bedrooms, and then go straight to the guest room where Robert was sleeping. Not only that, they left empty-handed. So there were valuables everywhere: electronics, wallets, a BlackBerry, watches, all completely untouched. Not a drawer opened, not a cabinet rifled through, nothing disturbed. So even if you entertained the possibility that the killer bypassed everything else in the house and went straight to Robert, why? What was the motive, and why stage it like that? The deeper you go, the less the intruder theory holds up, and investigators started feeling the same way. When investigators examined the guest room where Robert was found, one detail jumped out immediately, just like it had for the paramedics. There was almost no blood. Aside from a faint trace of blood on Robert's chest, the scene was eerily clean. There were only 2 small spots of blood on the bed, barely enough to match the severity of his wounds. And that's strange, considering Joseph told police he lifted Robert's shirt and saw a lot of blood. But here's the thing. Why would he need to lift the shirt at all? Robert was wearing a gray t-shirt. If he'd been actively bleeding, the blood would have soaked through and been visible without lifting anything. But it wasn't. The shirt had 3 clean holes where the knife punctured, 1 for each stab wound, but it was otherwise spotless. No blood soaked through, no staining, so you've got a victim with 3 deep stab wounds and barely a trace of blood anywhere on him, on the bed, or in the room. The bed itself was still made, the comforter was neatly folded down, and the pillow had 1 indentation as if Robert had simply laid down and then never moved. And that led detectives to 2 possibilities. Either Robert wasn't stabbed in that room at all and was placed there afterward, or he was stabbed there and then never moved a muscle. No reaction, no flinch, no struggle. Either way, the scene didn't add up. Okay, so let's go back to the towel for a moment, because remember on the 911 call, Victor is told to grab a towel and apply pressure to Robert's wounds, and Joseph later told investigators that he was the one actually doing that. Straightforward enough, okay. Except when investigators finally get a look at the towel that was supposedly used to try and save Robert's life, it doesn't quite line up. There is blood on it, yes, but barely. 3 tiny, small spots. One that's slightly more noticeable, and the others so faint they could be mistaken for a paper cut. It looks more like someone nicked their finger while cooking than something used to stop the bleeding from 3 deep stab wounds, including one directly to the heart. And it wasn't theoretical blood loss. We're talking about a wound deep enough to puncture the heart while it was still beating, the kind of injury that should have produced a significant amount of blood. But the towel, it doesn't match. This was the only blood-stained towel in the entire house, and yet there's not nearly enough on it to support the story that it was used to apply pressure. Which leads to a bigger question. Was it ever used for first aid at all? The theory that's emerged is that this towel may not have been used to help Robert, but instead to stage the scene. That it was dabbed in his blood after the fact, not to save him, but to transfer blood onto the knife that was conveniently found on the nightstand. The one Joseph claimed he removed from Robert's stomach. But that knife, well, it had its own problems, because when forensics took a closer look, the blood on it didn't match the expected pattern of stabbing. Instead, they found swipe marks, as if blood had been smeared on it deliberately, not splattered during an actual attack. The suspicion? Someone held the towel in one hand, placed the clean knife in the other, then pinched the towel around the blade, transferring just enough blood to make it look like the murder weapon. And it wouldn't be the only thing about that knife that didn't add up. Forensics took a closer look at the knife found on the nightstand, and immediately things started to fall apart. There was blood on the blade, yes, but only on the sides, not on the cutting edge. In other words, there was no way this knife could have actually been used to stab Robert. You don't plunge a knife 3 times into a torso and have the sharpest part come out clean. It gets more suspicious. They also found more than 10 white cotton fibers stuck to that blade, fibers consistent with the towel from the scene. But no gray fibers from Robert's t-shirt. His shirt had been clearly punctured by the weapon that killed him, so if this was the real murder weapon, you'd expect some of his shirt fibers to be on the blade, but there weren't any. Not one. And what does that tell us? It points to something staged. It suggests that the knife was wiped with the towel, not because someone was trying to clean it, but because they were trying to dirty it, trying to make it look used. But the blood pattern, it looked wiped on, not dripped, not spattered, wiped. And suddenly the scenario shifts. It's not just that the story doesn't add up, it starts to look like someone planted the knife entirely, that the real murder weapon was something else, that this knife was a stand-in, meant to throw investigators off. The idea might sound outlandish until you remember how clinical everything else felt in that house. And this leads us to something even more disturbing: the autopsy. Within 24 hours of Robert Wone's death, the autopsy was underway. Dr. Lois Kozlowski, a veteran medical examiner with over 2,000 cases behind her, handled the exam. Her findings were clear. Robert died from 3 stab wounds to the torso. It was homicide. Each wound was nearly identical, about 4.5 inches deep, clean and uniform in angle. The knife found in the nightstand measured 5.5 inches. So for that knife to be the weapon, the person wielding it would have had to stop an inch short, precisely, 3 times in a row. No overdrive, no hesitation, just 3 controlled punctures, all alike. It didn't seem realistic, not to Dr. Kozlowski, not to investigators, and that suspicion turned out to be right. The knife on the nightstand wasn't the murder weapon. It had been taken from the kitchen and planted to look like it was. But even more telling than the wounds themselves was what wasn't there. There were no defensive injuries on Robert, no bruising on his hands or forearms, nothing to suggest he tried to block the attack. His palms and fingers were clean, no smears of blood, no signs that he grabbed at his chest or abdomen. For someone who had just been stabbed 3 times, that was hard to explain. Dr. Kozlowski started to consider a possibility that was even more chilling. What if Robert hadn't been conscious when it happened? She noted that his injuries didn't show the kind of tearing or tissue disruption you'd expect if someone had tensed up or moved during an assault. The wounds were smooth, precise, almost surgical. And that raised the question: had he been paralyzed, sedated, unable to react? There were no ligature marks, no signs of restraint, no bruising on the wrist or ankles, but there were needle marks, and we'll come back to that. There was one other small detail that the medical examiner included in her report, one that hit a little harder. Robert had had his night guard in. His wife Kathy told investigators he had always brushed his teeth and then put his night guard in before going to bed. It was just a part of his routine. So that detail mattered, because it meant Robert was likely getting ready for bed. He had no reason to feel unsafe, no reason to expect anything unusual. He wasn't in fight mode, he was just winding down, probably just minutes away from turning out the light. And that brings us back to the question investigators kept circling. Was his heart even beating when he was stabbed? As we'll learn from the autopsy, the answer is yes. The lack of blood at the scene had me questioning everything. Was Robert already dead before the stabbing? Was the whole thing staged? But no. The autopsy revealed something crucial. After Robert was stabbed, blood had pooled in his digestive system. That meant his body was still functioning. His heart was beating. He was alive, barely, when those wounds were inflicted. The medical examiner ruled his cause of death as homicide by stabbing. But that wasn't all. There were at least 6 fresh needle marks on Robert's body, which immediately raised the question: had he been drugged, paralyzed, rendered unconscious? Naturally, you'd think that the next step would be a toxicology testing, and the medical examiner did test for the standard substances: alcohol, common drugs, all negative. But they didn't test for paralytics, not because they forgot, but because certain drugs like succinylcholine break down so quickly in the body that they often become undetectable within hours. So no, nothing was found. But that doesn't mean nothing was used. It just means we may never be able to prove it. The autopsy revealed something else, something that shook even seasoned investigators. There was evidence a pillow had been pressed to Robert's face. Whether it was an attempt to silence him or smother him, we can't say for sure. But it was clear someone had tried to control the situation long before the knife ever came out. As part of standard procedure, the medical examiner took swabs from multiple areas of Robert's body: his thighs, his genitals, his arms, his rectum. The purpose? To determine if there were any signs of recent sexual activity or assault. What they found? Semen. In every location swabbed. But here's where things took a turn. When the DNA came back, it all matched to Robert. Every single sample. Even the ones taken internally. That alone opens up a dark set of possibilities. And no, it's not about sexual orientation. It's not about speculation or innuendo. This case got sensationalized fast, and a lot of that centered on theories that Robert was secretly gay, that his visit to Swann Street was about more than just convenience. But there's no credible evidence, none, that Robert ever engaged in same-sex relationships. Investigators looked, they asked the hard questions, they found nothing to support that narrative. In fact, their conclusion was the opposite. Robert had been sexually assaulted before his death. The presence of his own DNA in his rectum doesn't cancel that out, it underscores it. It's possible, and deeply disturbing, that he was assaulted using an object. Maybe something clinical, maybe something meant to leave as little trace as possible beyond what was already horrifying. So when you lay out the sequence, unconsciousness from a likely paralytic, a sexual assault, an attempted smothering, and finally, 3 precise stab wounds, it stops feeling like a spontaneous crime. It starts to look methodical, planned, controlled. And meanwhile, the people in that house, the ones that were there that night, are still pointing to an intruder who somehow pulled this off, vanished without a trace, and left them untouched. That version of events doesn't just stretch belief, it snaps it in half. Once the autopsy was done, investigators turned their attention back to the townhouse. They wanted to see what else could be uncovered beyond the guest room, beyond the body. During the search, only one drug was recovered: ecstasy. That's it. Nothing else. No cocaine, no marijuana, no opioids. But here's where it gets strange. Specially trained drug dogs hit on 2 separate locations in the house, one in Dylan's room and one in Joseph's. Yet, when officers searched those areas, they came up empty. That detail stuck with me, because while none of those substances were found in Robert's system, there was still this lingering question of whether something else, something harder to trace, had ever been used to immobilize him. And then they found something that changed the tone of the case entirely. In Dylan's room, police uncovered a collection of sex toys, restraints, and BDSM-related materials. Honestly, not that surprising. He and Joseph were known to have a dominant submissive dynamic, and what consenting adults decide to keep in their bedroom isn't the issue here. What was notable was one very specific item: an electrical stimulation device, sometimes referred to as a milking machine. Clinically, it's used to induce ejaculation through electric pulses, but it also has applications in kink communities, and this one was found tucked away among Dylan's belongings. Investigators believed it could have been used during Robert's assault, and if so, it might explain why Robert's own semen was found in multiple locations, including internally. And if the device was used, someone had to retrieve it, use it, clean it, and return it without raising suspicion. Here's where things start to unravel. Dylan's room was just down the hall, and he claimed he slept through everything. If this device was used on Robert, someone would have needed access to it during that narrow window of time, and they would have needed enough composure to return it neatly afterward. That level of coordination doesn't exactly scream random intruder. Police did collect the machine, but to this day, there's no public record of it ever being tested, or what it might have revealed. Among the items recovered from Dylan's room was a professional cutlery set, a detail that might have seemed ordinary given his background as a trained chef. But one piece in that set caught investigators' attention for all of the wrong reasons. Or rather, didn't catch it, because, well, it was missing. Gone. Nowhere to be found. The set included a large carving knife, a fork, and a conspicuously empty slot where a smaller knife should have been. A knife, it turns out, that would have measured about 4.5 inches. The same length as Robert's stab wounds. The knife has never been found. It's one of those moments that shifts the air in the room, because when a murder weapon goes missing and the one knife that everyone matched is gone from a set found just down the hall, it's not just a coincidence. It's a void that demands explanation. And here's the other thing. That missing knife, it wasn't just absent. It was perfectly absent. No broken case, no sign it had been recently removed in haste. It looked like a piece that had been taken out carefully. deliberately, which raises the same question we've been circling for a while now. If this was a break-in, if this was some unknown intruder, why take the time to remove a specific knife from a chef's personal set? Why risk that? And maybe more importantly, why hasn't it ever turned up? No knife, and still, hardly any blood. When crime scene techs started processing the house, they used something called Ashley's reagent, a chemical designed to detect latent traces of blood. I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of it before, and it sounds super high-tech, maybe even promising, but in practice, it's finicky, at best. The reagent lit up 170 different items in the house as possible blood evidence. But when the FBI ran proper lab tests on those same items, nothing. Not a single one came back positive. And to make matters worse, the way it was applied was totally botched and actually contaminated the scene. Any evidence that might have been there was compromised, and just like that, gone. In a case where every trace matters, this was a major setback, so they tried something else. A cadaver dog trained to sniff out blood and decomposition. And this is where it gets interesting, because dogs like that, I trust them more than any chemical spray. The dog alerted in two places. One was a drain outside of the back courtyard, and the other, the dryer lint trap. Let that sit for a second, because blood in a dryer lint trap, next to an uncoiled hose outside by the drain, it paints a picture, doesn't it? Someone washing themselves off outside, tossing their bloodied clothes in the dryer, trying to erase the mess. And here's what makes it even more suspicious. All three men in the house were wearing bathrobes when police arrived. Officers even noted how freshly showered they looked. But if someone was so drenched in blood that they needed to hose off, where did that crime happen? Because it wasn't in the guest room, we've already covered that. The room was clean. Too clean. It didn't match the level of violence this theory suggests, and here's where the timeline really starts to fall apart, because emergency responders got to Swann Street within minutes of the 911 call. How would anyone have had time to clean all of this up? The only way it works is if the timeline we've been given isn't the full story. And just when it seemed like the trail was going cold, someone new enters the picture. Not a suspect, not a detective, just a neighbor. There was one person who might have heard something the others didn't. The neighbor next door. Their bedroom shared a wall with the guest room where Robert was staying. On the night of August 2nd, they were in bed watching late news, and they remembered a specific segment that aired at around 11 to 11:30 p.m. And during that time, they heard a scream. Now, if you remember, the men in the house described soft, breathy grunts, barely audible. But the neighbor, they were clear. What they heard wasn't subtle, it was a full-on scream. That's a big difference. And here's where it gets interesting. A lot of people think that what the neighbor heard was actually Victor's reaction when he found Robert. If that's true, it could shift the entire timeline. Because if the scream happened anytime before 11:30 and that's when they found the body, then the 911 call, which didn't come in until 11:49, was delayed by at least 19 minutes. Worst case, that scream happened closer to 11 when the segment started. That would mean 49 minutes went by before anyone picked up the phone. And if you believe that timeline, you have to ask, what were they doing during that time? It's even messier when you factor in Robert's BlackBerry. Investigators found 2 draft emails, one to his wife, another to a friend about lunch plans for the next day. Both were timestamped at 11:07 p.m., and neither one was sent. On its own, that detail narrows the window. But I keep coming back to this, because why 2 drafts? If someone interrupted him mid-email, maybe, but 2 half-finished drafts? It feels off. To me, it sounds more like someone unfamiliar with the BlackBerry tried to create a false timeline, but didn't know how to send the messages. We'll never know for sure, because somehow the chain of custody on Robert's phone got completely screwed up. It was returned to his workplace and completely wiped clean before anyone could do proper forensic testing. In 2008, federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner officially charged Joe Price, Victor Zaborski, and Dylan Ward, not with murder, but with obstruction of justice. And then came the affidavit. It was direct. Quote, "The evidence demonstrates that Robert Wone was restrained, incapacitated, sexually assaulted, and murdered inside 1509 Swann Street. There exists overwhelming evidence far in excess of probable cause that Joseph, Victor, and Dylan obstructed justice by altering and orchestrating the crime scene, planting evidence, delaying the reporting of the murder to authorities, and lying to the police about the true circumstances of the murder." The defense fired back, accusing the government of overreach, of stacking assumptions, of painting a narrative without hard facts. And through all of it, the 3 men stuck to their story. They didn't kill Robert Wone. If anyone was still holding on to the idea of an intruder, this document was the moment that started to fall apart. The affidavit didn't pull punches. It alleged that Robert Wone had been restrained, incapacitated, sexually assaulted, and murdered inside the Swann Street townhouse, and that afterward, the three men orchestrated an elaborate cover-up, altering the scene, planting evidence, delaying the 911 call, and lying to police about what actually happened. For investigators, it was a turning point. For the public, it was a jolt. Suddenly, the case wasn't just tragic, it was chilling, and with that, both sides began preparing for trial. 2 weeks out from trial, the defense team filed a motion to suppress any mention of sexual misconduct, arguing that it had no bearing on the murder itself. The judge agreed, meaning any references to semen, DNA, or BDSM devices were officially off the table. For the prosecution, it was a major blow. Then came another twist. The defense asked for a bench trial, no jury. They claimed that the media coverage had been so extensive that there was no way to find an impartial panel. The prosecution didn't fight it, and the judge signed off. When verdict day arrived, Judge Lynn Leibovitz took the bench and started reading her decision. 47 minutes in total, pulled from a 38-page ruling. She shut down the intruder theory right away. In her view, there was no credible evidence that someone had broken in and murdered Robert Wone. She pointed to the strange behavior of the men, their inconsistent statements, and the staged feeling crime scene. But where the prosecution believed the knife had been planted, the judge disagreed. She thought it was the actual murder weapon. Still, she said that the prosecution hadn't met the burden of proof. There were too many gaps, not enough hard evidence. And while she made it clear that she believed the men knew exactly what happened, that wasn't enough for a conviction. The verdict? Not guilty. On August 3, 2011, Kathy Wone filed a $20 million wrongful death lawsuit against Joe Price, Victor Zaborski, and Dylan Ward. The three men invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer any questions. Eventually, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but no real accountability ever came from it. Just another chapter that ends in silence. Okay, so we could spend hours trying to make sense of what happened inside that house, but the truth is, only 4 people know what really went on: Joseph, Victor, Dylan, and Robert. And only one of them isn't here to speak for himself. What makes this case so difficult isn't just that it's unsolved, it's that it feels intentionally obscured. The evidence contradicts the story, the timeline is warped, and every time you think you're getting close to something solid, it slips. What really gets me is the human part of it. Robert wasn't crashing with strangers, he was staying with a friend, someone he trusted. His wife had no reason to worry, and it was supposed to be just a normal night. And instead, she lost her husband and to this day doesn't have answers. You think about the effort it would have taken to stage that scene, to clean it, to choose silence over truth, and you ask yourself, why? Why would 3 men, successful, respected, risk everything to cover this up? It's hard to believe no one is in prison for this. There are wrongful convictions in this country every day, and yet here, with all these inconsistencies and red flags, no one was held accountable for Robert Wone's death. Cases like this don't just haunt investigators, they haunt everyone who spends time with them. Because deep down, you know that something terrible happened and someone got away with it. Robert Wone's case is one of those stories that stays with you, not because of what we know, but because of what we still don't. A man trusted his friends, stepped into their home, and never walked back out. And nearly 2 decades later, there's still no justice. No clear timeline, no accountability. The details don't make sense, the timeline doesn't hold, and the silence from the people closest to it says more than any theory ever could. If this story stuck with you the way it stuck with me, don't let it sit in silence. Talk about it, ask questions, and keep Robert's name in the conversation, because the worst thing we can do with cases like this is forget them. If this case left you thinking, I'd love to hear what's turning over in your mind. So join in the conversation on Instagram and TikTok at Darkly Speaking Podcast. And don't forget to head on over to our website to check out the show notes and source material at darklyspeakingpodcast.com. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you next week with a brand new episode.